An excerpt from a book on John Muir's early life, September 8th, 1867. He took a train from Indianapolis to Louisville. Just a few miles south of Louisville, Muir spread his map under a tree and plotted a southeasterly route through Kentucky and Tennessee to Georgia, carrying a plant press and a bag with 3 books: Poetry of Burns, a New Testament, and Paradise Lost. He set out on his 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf of Mexico. Sitting by a stream in Tennessee at the end of a hard day, with the loneliness creeping over him, he was serenaded by a tiny bird. Quote, "It had a wonderful expressive eye," he noted, "and in one moment that cheerful, confiding bird preached me the most impressive sermon upon heavenly trust that I have ever heard." A more uplifting sermon than any delivered in a church during this fall of 1867. In the course of working out his own philosophy, Muir made a permanent break from Christianity. Characteristically, he went through the process by himself, without discussing it with other people. Nor did he learn or expect much from books. He still read his New Testament, but more for the stately cadences of prose than for theological ideas. Instead, it came down to a private communion between Muir and nature. Under its spell, he reached his conclusions by intuitive leaps and flashes.
I'm going to move this back just a moment. There we go. So, John Muir did most of his work in California, though he went to Alaska, and he actually went around the world with Mr. E.H. Harriman of the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. Did a bunch of interesting things, but I figured it would be a good spot to start in San Francisco Bay area. So in San Francisco Bay, almost under the Golden Gate Bridge, there's a ship called the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, which was built as one of the Liberty ships during World War II. How many of you have been there? 1, 2, 3, 4. Holy cow, 5 of them. Good. Well, Liberty ships were simple freighters, not fancy things like the USS New Jersey, which coincidentally is docked almost under the Ben Franklin Bridge in Camden, New Jersey. But long before the battleship New Jersey came back to Camden, the Jeremiah O'Brien was in San Francisco Bay, and I was in San Francisco Bay as the Bay Area at least, as a contract electrical engineer. One Saturday, I went and saw the Jeremiah O'Brien, which was pretty permanently tied up at Pier 45 or something like that in San Francisco. And so I went on and I wandered along the deck, which wasn't all that big, and I went up to the bridge, which wasn't all that impressive, and then there was a ladder down, what's it called, a way, or whatever it is, down to the engine room. So I went down to the engine room to have a look. And the engine is this beautifully polished thing of brass and steel and everything else. And it has all these knobs. And there were a set of 3 knobs that said water intake. And the first one said forward tank. And that means the front of the ship. There's a big water tank somewhere, I guess. The next one said aft tank. And in the back of the ship, there's another water tank. Makes sense. And the third one had actually sort of broken off and had a new label put on years ago. And it said, Hetch Hetchy. Now, I'm from New Jersey, and I have no idea what Hetch Hetchy means. Maybe it was some local joke, the name of one of the engineers or something like that. Maybe it was a type of beer like Anchor Steam beer or something like that, or a homemade gin, sort of like hooch or something. Hetch Hetchy. Anyway, it would be several years before I learned what Hetch Hetchy means. Let's go back in time a little bit now, just after the Civil War, when John Muir steps onto the stage. By now, just about everywhere in the United States had been discovered. Discovered by Europeans, I mean. Lewis and Clark expedition ended 60 years earlier. Gold had been discovered in California 20 years earlier, and the whole gold rush thing was over 10 years ago. There was still a chance to discover new plant species. And in the reading, John Muir heads south through Kentucky with a plant press and a notebook, probably to describe the new things that he discovered. After he gets to Florida, John Muir heads to California, arriving in San Francisco a year before the Transcontinental Railroad was built, just to give you some context. And Muir knew what he wanted to do. He headed straight for Yosemite in the Sierras. Listen to this diary entry. June 6th. We're now in the mountains, and they are in us, kindling enthusiasm, making every nerve quiver, filling every pore and cell of us. Our flesh and bone tabernacle seems transparent as glass to the beauty about us, as if truly an inseparable part of it. Thrilling with air and trees, streams and rocks in the waves of the sun, a part of all nature, neither young nor old, sick nor well, but immortal. Just now, I can hardly conceive any bodily condition dependent on food or breath any more than on ground or sky. How glorious a conversion, so complete and wholesome it is, scarce memory enough of old bondage days left as a standpoint to view it from them. The newness of life, we seem to have been so always. Anyway, Muir was actually up there to herd sheep, but instead he saw the sacredness of all life. Now, back in 1864, President Lincoln had declared the Yosemite Valley area to be set aside for preservation and public use. California was given the control over it, and they considered sheep herding a public use, and they still allowed it within the park. And Muir, in his job, watched what sheep did to the native plants, completely denuding the hills. For example, he writes, "Sheep, like people, are ungovernable when hungry. Excepting my guarded lily gardens, almost every leaf that these hoofed locusts can reach within the radius of a mile or two from camp has been devoured. Even bushes are stripped bare, and in spite of the dogs and shepherds, the sheep scatter to all points of the compass and vanish in dust. I fear some are lost, for one of the 16 black ones is missing." So the job of herding these hoofed locusts lasts all summer, with ample time for him to explore. Though he didn't herd sheep again, Muir finds other ways to come back up into the Sierra Nevadas and back to Yosemite. He works at a sawmill, developing ways of harvesting wood which has fallen into the river. And he builds a cabin on the edge of Yosemite Creek, where he lives for a while. He spends his time hiking, journaling, and observing. And he takes along a book of Ralph Waldo Emerson's nature essays for reading by the campfire. Now, Emerson, prophet of transcendentalism, once told divinity students to go out and see the world. The doors of the temple stand open night and day before every man, and the oracles of truth cease never. Boy, they wrote odd in the 19th century, didn't they? He said, the temple is guarded by one stern condition, namely, virtue is an intuition. It can't be received secondhand, meaning you have to go and Go there yourself, which is basically what Muir is doing here. A few years later, while Muir is still up in Yosemite, the aging Emerson and his friends take a trip. They're one of those tourists that comes over the North Dome. And when they meet, Muir and Emerson spend a day together. Emerson offers Muir a professorship back at Harvard. Does it surprise anyone that Muir turned him down? Let's leave that history behind for a moment and think about the enthusiasm John Muir felt when he came into the mountains. He says that the human body, our flesh and bone tabernacle, is part of all nature, neither young nor old, sick nor well, but immortal. Oh, that's pretty trippy. Do you know anyone who has been that turned on by something? Now, I've seen movies of surfers describing the waves that they've caught or the waves that they haven't caught, and this tumble of words and images and similes and metaphors that come out of their mouths has a sort of a sense of momentary immortality. That reminds me a lot of Muir. And I bet you can think of other different examples. Maybe? I have a friend who once subjected me to an hour-long cassette tape recording of a bagpipe convention. As we sped down the highway, he would suddenly throw his hand in the air and say, "That's a slow air," or "That's a jig." And basically all I could do was to say, "Nice," and stay on the road. And then there's a famous video on the internet of someone in a mountain cabin, coincidentally in Yosemite, seeing a double rainbow. And he spends 2 minutes bobbing around with this video camera, explaining, double rainbow, what does it mean?" And then he breaks down in tears and laughter. Yeah, you've seen it, haven't you? And then there's just a moment entering into the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican and seeing someone just standing there, looking up with tears streaming down their face. These are transcendent moments. They're sacred moments. It's interesting to note that John Muir's sense of holiness wasn't quite the same as the Transcendentalists. Several authors have tried to reconstruct what John Muir believed in. Some said that he was still Christian. Others said that he left his father's Campbellite Protestantism behind, and when he left Presbyterianism behind, he left all Christianity behind. But Muir was writing in a time when Christianity was the assumed metaphor. And so he expressed his beliefs using Christian terms and quoting from the New Testament. For example, he accepted William Ellery Channing's concept of a loving God, updated a little bit perhaps. He writes to his sister, who is still a very devout Presbyterian, "Whatever we can read in all the world is contained in that sentence of boundless meaning, God is love." He's hard to pin down. He refuses to accept, for example, Darwin's concept that all life is a struggle, feeling that there's some sort of divine guidance at work in life. One author points out that Emerson saw nature as evidence of a transcendental philosophy of God, while Muir simply saw nature as awesome and didn't want the philosophical baggage placed on it. So John Muir stays in California, exploring the Sierras, noticing animals and plants, and the impacts of human habitation. And after being a bachelor mountain man for a decade, he marries a woman who has a farm near Oakland, California, and he begins the next phase of his life as a fruit grower and a husband and a father. He also starts a career as a travelogue writer, converting his journals into articles and books. It worked for Emerson. Those are the writings that made him famous, and those are the writings that changed the course of American history. In 1890, Muir and the publisher of The Century magazine, a man named Robert Underwood Johnson, lobby Congress to create a national park around Yosemite Valley. Sheep herding is ended, but the remaining sequoia are still being logged, and tourism is spoiling the natural beauty of the Yosemite Valley itself, which is still in California control. Then Muir and Berkeley professor Joseph LeConte found the Sierra Club to lobby for the creation of many more Western national parks and state parks, preserving the remaining sequoia and redwood forests and scenic areas up and down the long mountain range. You know, in 1903, John Muir and President Teddy Roosevelt went on a campout for 3 days. Can you imagine any president simply going camping for 3 days? I'll be back on Thursday, don't worry about me. Anyway, Muir convinces TR to take control of Yosemite Valley and the nearby sequoia groves back from California, and to come up with a federal preservation plan for the now unified Yosemite National Park. And Roosevelt does. And the land's preserved. Almost. The Yosemite National Park is now much bigger than the Yosemite Valley, with its famous Half Dome and Yosemite Falls and Bridal Veil Falls and all those things. It now includes several other valleys and the headwaters of the rivers that come down out of the Sierra Nevada mountains. One of these valleys is the Hetch Hetchy Valley, 2 rivers north of Yosemite Creek. And after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, the city of San Francisco makes a bid for control of Hetch Hetchy Valley. It's a reliable and clean water supply for the city. The Sierra Club, with the aging John Muir, doesn't like this, and they lobby against the damming of the river, which flows into Hetch Hetchy Valley. But unlike the preservation of Yosemite Valley, this time the Sierra Club doesn't have full popular support. Many people living in San Francisco, for example, want the dam built. They want reliable sources of water. And so John Muir spends his final days fighting a losing battle. The valve in the Liberty ship SS Jeremiah O'Brien's engine room labeled Hetch Hetchy was the one that brought San Francisco city water into the boiler. Today, the flooded Hetch Hetchy Valley supplies about 1/4 of San Francisco County's water. And that brings us to the religious aspect of all this. Muir was a preservationist. He was a sort of a mystical preservationist, or, if you will, a sentimental preservationist. In many of his efforts, he was joined by business leaders who were instead utilitarian conservationists. people who agreed with Muir that the preservation of Yosemite Valley was needed because they saw that it did good for humankind. It was beautiful, and it was a good tourist destination for people to go to. Beyond the valley, the preservation of the Sierra headwaters meant that the river flowing through Hetch Hetchy would supply people with good, clean drinking water. Not that headwaters were intrinsically good. Preservation is good only when you can do something with the preserved thing. Bringing this home a little bit, you can make that same sort of argument here in New Jersey. In fact, right here where we are. The Pine Barrens Reserve may have been preserved by the National Park Service and the state of New Jersey because it represents unique ecosystems found nowhere else in the world. But it could also be thought of as being preserved because it provides water into an aquifer that's used by the bustling communities of the Jersey Shore. So which reason is it that the Pine Barrens were preserved? For nature or for tourism? Well, the good news is that it's both. And we don't really have to answer that question. Do we put up solar panels on this building to save money, a utilitarian thing? Or do we put it up to save planet Earth? When an action is both practical and spiritually fulfilling, the answer is pretty easy. And the public's willing to spend real money to achieve that sort of common goal. But sometimes they're in conflict. For example, is the sunrise owned by the beach? Or should large wind farms exist just offshore to make clean energy? Is swimming by humans and birds and fish in a clean ocean a right? Or can the state or federal government sell offshore oil leases to potentially make somebody a lot of money when there is always the possibility of an accident fouling the beaches and estuaries if something goes wrong? Again, sorry, I was in Louisiana for a couple of years. Should non-native feral cats be killed to protect shorebirds, or should they be fed? That one's a little bit more complicated. Where does the holy end and the practical begin? And what is holy? Do only the pretty valleys get preserved? Or the cute, non-poisonous animals get protected? Originally there was a line in here that said, do we build tunnels for the turtles, or do we let them cross the road at their own risk? But that got cut out. This world has its share of mystical preservationists and utilitarian conservationists. This past week, I watched an interview with Bill Moyers. It's online. He was talking with a political psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. And Professor Haidt made several really interesting points. One was that all big political decisions are not logical. They are based on the concept of sacredness. Okay, I saw those eyebrows raise. We might look at capital punishment, for example, which we do not have in New Jersey, thank goodness. But for some, human life, even the life of a convicted killer, or of convicted killers, is sacred. For others, the law of crime and punishment is sacred, and to not kill a guilty one is to break God's sacred law. Two understandings of sacred. Now, there are also financial aspects of capital punishment, but I think these are only used to camouflage the arguments of sacred rules which we hold in our hearts. Availability of publicly funded education is, in this country, sacred. And perhaps one day, availability of publicly funded health care for everyone will be sacred too. It's a role of the mystics to reveal the sacredness in this world. John Muir was not famous for the quality of fruit that he grew in his orchards, or for the inventions that he made at the sawmill, or any new plant species, and I don't even know if there was one, that he discovered. John Muir was famous for his preaching about the temple of all space in the religion of the mountains and the glaciers and the grasshoppers. John Muir saw the sacred in things untouched by civilization, processes which were still wild, and he had urged us to experience these things firsthand rather than reading about them in books or listening to them in long and boring sermons. I have a challenge for all of you in the months ahead, a sort of a self-understanding challenge. This summer, whether you spend it sitting on a bench each lunch hour, or whether you climb mountains in Tibet, all you going to Tibet this year, raise your hand. No, but today. Ask yourself, what is sacred to you? And when you hear someone in disagreement that makes you angry, don't tell them they're wrong. Ask them what's sacred to them. By stretching yourself in experience, stretching yourself in acceptance, stretching yourself in the ecstatic joy of new connections and new experiences, you just might find a new way to see the world, a way to be immortal, and maybe find a way to share that vision. Once you know what is sacred, the path becomes clear. In the words of transcendentalist Theodore Parker, be ours a religion which, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its ritual, works of love. Its profession of faith, divine living. Happy summer, everyone. Peace, love. Amen.